Alessandro Carrera e i nostri ospiti stasera. Stefano Albertini non è con noi, quindi io on behalf of the Italian Department of Italian Studies and Casa Italiana, I want to give a warm welcome back to Alessandro Carrera, who has been one of our most esteemed colleagues for a few years at the beginning of his US career. Professor Carrera now teaches at the University of Houston, Texas, where he is the director also of the graduate program. And Professor Carrera this evening is here because we will present his book on Italian theory, philosophical book of philosophy and the philosophers. And Professor Carrera will be introduced by our former student, Dr. Gabrielle Sims, and after we will have a kind of a conversation with the most prestigious scholars as Professor Peter Carravetta, Alfonso D'Amato, professor at Stony, Brook, and Paolo Valesio, Giuseppe Ungaretti, professor at Columbia University. Professor Carrera has worked on two books for a long time, and one of these books is Italian Critical Theory, Today and Tomorrow, published in 2011. He is the editor of this book, and then he has also published in the same year a book on Leopardi, lo spazio dell'ispirazione, la distanza dal cielo, Leopardi e lo spazio dell'ispirazione. So, Gabrielle Sims will speak about Alessandro Carrera as a scholar of Leopardi. I give the word to Gabrielle.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I don't think I'm not used to this microphone. Good evening. I'm going to speak about Professor Alessandro Carrera's work on Leopardi. Why? Why, I think, and I'm going to try to connect it to a lot of the themes that we may or may not discuss in relation to Italian critical theory, this new volume. But even if we don't, I think that they can give some insight as to why I would be here now, and also why I think working on Leopardi might be part of the future of, if not Italian critical theory, Italian philosophy, and hopefully getting into the spirit of the introductory essay in Italian critical theory, philosophy, without the word Italian in front of it, just philosophy. I'll hopefully be able to explain why that's so important in a minute. So I'm presenting La distanza del cielo, Leopardi e lo spazio dell'ispirazione, Leopardi, the distance of the heavens, Leopardi in the space of inspiration, the space of creation, basically. And in the spirit of this evening's discussion, I thought I might step out of my mental habit of one whose impressions of life, even at the most mundane level, or perhaps especially there, are by now at least partly filtered through Giacomo Leopardi. I genuinely wonder, for example, what Leopardi would think of genome mapping, or the Mars landing, or the dire lack of genuine debate in current political culture, genuine philosophical debate, the kind that critiques the very existence and the structure of institutions and disciplines, for example, and does not halt its thought process at the question of how to improve the ones we already have. Academics are not allowed to assume anything of their readers or listeners in the United States, or in my native Australia, where I had my first encounter with Leopardi's poetry, and where my professor at the time was forced to interrupt several lessons on the canti with repeated justifications for studying them. Scholars are constantly asked why. Why should anyone read and study fill in the blank? At the very beginning of one's career, as I am in mine, this question can get irritating, or if not irritating, exactly disheartening, until we come across the astoundingly many books of one such as Professor Carrera, who does not shy away from this question and rather rephrases and embraces it as part of the critic's task. We find it irritating, perhaps disheartening, until, therefore, we understand the question of why as a potentially highly constructive one. I'm going to try to be brief to introduce this book that preceded Italian critical theory, La distanza del cielo. And my brevity is facilitated significantly by the book's own pithy thematic of proximity and distance, the internal that is with great difficulty distinguished from what is external. Of course, as the subtitle, Leopardi and the Space of Inspiration indicates, these dichotomies are first to be understood as a problem of poetics. To what extent poetry negotiates the fluidity and/or fixity of the categories of internal and external, proximity and distance, maternal and paternal. I will return to this broader question in a moment, and I will return to it briefly, I promise. For now, I want to emphasize the naming of Leopardi in the book's title as a way into the question of inspiration. It is Leopardi and the space of inspiration, not the space of inspiration in Leopardi. As a newly minted scholar of Leopardi myself, this is even more promising than a book about Leopardi, of which there are many. Why? Because precisely by writing a book in which the first sentence is "Questo è un libro su Leopardi, ma non solo." This is a book about Leopardi, but not Leopardi alone. Professor Carrera has made that giant leap, that giant necessary leap, in this otherwise self-enclosed field, hardly if at all studied in the English-speaking world, into the almost infinite tapestry of topics, references, latent meanings, and associations available to a nimble reader of Leopardi's writings, to frankly the only kind of reader who will be able to read Leopardi as and for a modern audience. To strike upon a theme that I imagine will arise in the context of the discussion of Italian critical theory, I will call La distanza del cielo a translation in historical, theoretical, national terms of a poet who was also a philosopher, and for whom boundaries were limits, but for whom the limit was the actual space of inspiration. I say this not only because the one poem to which Carrera returns repeatedly in his analysis, L'Infinito, the infinite, is itself an instantiation of the vicissitudes of poetic composition that bring it alternately into contact with concrete, visceral things, like, speaking of this poem, hills, hedges, fear, drowning, which are personalized, anchored in a space and an experience of that place by the poet. And at the other extreme, fleeting and constantly receding and expanding things, like the wind, space, the horizon, the limit. I use the word vicissitudes on purpose, to call up the Freudian set of meanings available from this image of poetry as trafficking between the internal and the external, the symptom and the idea, the historically specific and the eminently translatable. This is the same Freudian interpretive possibility that we find, for example, in chapter 6 of La distanza del cielo, in which the analysis weaves together a history of the sublime from its ancient rhetorical forms to its more modern naturalistic forms, and a later articulation to the language of psychoanalysis. This critical and historical breadth, and variety of names and national traditions that such breadth inevitably invokes, is an indispensable contribution to Leopardi studies, if Leopardi is to be considered anything other than a lunatic. To reference the case of Giovanni Gentile from the opening pages of Italian critical theory. Or by all means consider him a lunatic, as long as we understand that the label may often be given to those who make us uncomfortable because they relentlessly ask why, what for, and could it be otherwise? how does this come about? And we don't have a disciplinary space for that, or we don't anymore, or not yet. For those of us who are putting Leopardi on syllabi and conference panels, left, right, and center, the work of Professor Carrera is a crucial fermata. Now, I want to just close by saying, this, the importance of studying Leopardi now and going forward is perhaps that Leopardi can be an example of one of those eminently translatable authors. So I think that the contribution of La distanza del cielo, for those of us who are starting out, we're going to need to keep this book in mind, and I think that is a significant contribution. So for one, thank you as a new scholar of Leopardi, and thank you for translating this important 19th century thinker into really 21st century terms. Right? So, thank you.
I would say that Gabrielle Sims has written a very important dissertation, extremely brilliant dissertation on Leopardi, and just the defense has been just a few months ago, and in July, and so now this is the reason why she has introduced the Professor Carrera, who has been one of her advisors. I was also part of the committee, so I am happy about that. Thank you.
I know that the dissertation was very good because I read it very carefully. Okay, now I want to show you, the fragment that you've seen at the beginning is part of a documentary realized by Rocco Ronchi of the University of L'Aquila and a young documentary director from Albania, Zef Mojani. And they have interviewed 4 Italian philosophers, namely Gianni Vattimo, who you just saw, Vincenzo Vitiello, Massimo Cacciari, Carlo Sini. The beginning of the interview, the starting point is a series of meetings that those philosophers and others had at Monte Pidoni and Perugia in the early 80s. And then there was a brief follow-up at Gargnano on the Lake of Garda. And I was fortunate enough to be in a couple of those meetings, in fact. So Vattimo started talking about how these meetings came to be, and then the discussion progresses toward what was that generation in Italian philosophy, what it brought, the kind of rupture with the breakup with the past that they tried to build up, to develop a new Italian philosophy along different lines that were not following the classical historicist line. So this is what Vattimo, Cacciari, Sini and Vitiello are discussing in the part of the documentary that I want to show you. It's 13 minutes, and then we can have a discussion with Professor Carravetta and Professor Valesio. And it will be related, of course, to the book that I edited, the one that you see over there, Italian Critical Theory. In a way, this looks like a prequel to the whole discussion, because it speaks of when Italian philosophy turned away from some models that were still very operative in the 50s and 60s, early 70s, and they tried to move in the 80s toward the direction of hermeneutics, which now someone says that it's obsolete already, but regardless of what it is, obsolete or not, it was an important turn, and it has produced a significant body of work for at least 30 years.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone. Thank NYU for being here. This is my alma mater. And,
I don't hear.
I'm sorry? Okay. Well, I'm very happy to be here with old friends, and I'm very happy that Italian philosophy and critical thought makes another major appearance. Some of you know that we all 3 of us have worked in this field for a very long time. As Alessandro gracefully acknowledges the work that I've done in this field with Differenzia for 15 years. And I'll take the opportunity to put in a little plug for myself, and then I stop, because it was here at NYU in 1983 that we had this major conference on Italian contemporary thought, in which we had quite a number of people. And it was on that occasion that Gianni Vattimo read his famous essay on weak thought, and Berniolo was here. I think, Remo, you were here also. Aldo Gargani, Ricciardo Silandi, I think he couldn't make it, but he was here. Jen Jameson, Edward Said, Richard Gorty, and he started here in 1983. Some of the papers were published in the Graduate School Philosophy Journal, but then the Pensiero Debole finally came out this week. So I'm glad that Vitiello said that in philosophy it's not like history as a sequence, it's always contemporary, so to speak. So even though this thing comes out 15 years too late, it does cover what Vattimo was saying before about philosophy in the 80s, and Cacciari too. There was a kind of a sea change. And with terrorism on the one hand, and some old models of epistemology and anthropology being kind of like having had their day from the 50s, 60s, 70s. And that's part of the work that I was doing, and Alessandro actually reconstructs this in his introduction. New models came into the 80s. I think some of the authors in here, there's 11 authors, tried to open up new perspectives. And maybe we will talk about this particular book some other time, when we do a little bit more traditional historiography of ideas. I do want to say that about 5 years ago, finally, another anthology came out, edited by Sylvia Benz and Brian Schroeder. And in this anthology, I do find some of the philosophers who were still at their best, I don't know, they were like sort of like Cresta del Mondo, we would say, in the 80s and the 90s. Including, as you heard right now, Carlosini, Sergio Givone, Vincenzo Vitiello, Vattimo, Melchiorre, our qui presente Remo Bodei, and a few others. But there's also the beginning of new names, which show that the generation is changing. And as we get to 2011, when Alessandro undertakes this most ungrateful work, because to do an anthology and translate or supervise the translation of 15, 18 people, what is it, the more, I think, 20? I mean, it's like you probably forgot, and you don't, and you want to forget. Having done this kind of work myself, it's the work that is actually necessary. It's what allows a culture to be transmitted from not only diachronically, but also from one country to the other. So it's actually the work that we always tell our younger students to do, and that's what I did in my day. So I really want, as a part of this process and part of this profession, I want to thank you for this. The work here is it's going to be hopefully republished as a book, not just as an edition of a special edition of a journal. Divided into 4 sections: theoretical workshop, and I'll say something about each one; ethics and bioethics, which is the big novelty, as Alessandro points out in his introduction; literature and the arts, which is probably the weakest of them all. No, maybe not.
Well, because it wasn't intended to be a book on literature and the
well,
arts.
I have
an interesting contributions.
No, the contributions themselves are interesting.
It wasn't the main focus of the book.
Don't feel that I'm attacking.
Oh,
I'm
no,
just
no,
commenting.
No.
Well, what I was looking for was somebody who was doing literary theory, with categories, and that's gone to some degree, and which is good. In some way, we're in the age of the essay now. And then there's history and geography of Italian theory. This is a very problematic section, and I hope we have a few moments to talk about that, because it's both very innovative, but also at the same time it raises some old specters about what does it mean to have a national philosophy, which is an unresolved question. So I will have something to say about each one of them. I can only indicate to you some of the ones that I found extremely interesting, important, and as I comment on them, there's an intrigue to all of you to pick up the volume, read it, and comment. I will write about this, but right now I'll just limit myself to some comments. First of all, I was very happy to see that he published an interview, a tape lecture by his former teacher, Professor Enzo Paci, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century in Italy, who is basically responsible after Banfi to introduce Husserl in Italy, and he was one of the few who tried to meld phenomenology and Marxism. I actually have a little anecdote memory. I went to Milan in '78 to do my dissertation, and I had read Enzo Paci, you know, the Enciclopedia, the Relazione, Significato, and I said, okay, I have to meet Enzo Paci. So I finally have summoned enough courage to go to the istituto, e ero molto timido, dico, ma potrei parlare, no, con il professore Enzo Paci, e questa qui con la sala segretaria con una faccia, professore Paci, non c'è più, no. And I understood, dico, si è trasferito, no, non c'è più, he's no longer with us. E niente, so, I never met him, però poi ho conosciuto Sini e altri, sono stato lì 2 o 3 anni. This is a debate on Antonioni's L'Eclisse. It makes me at least, I don't know what Paolo thinks, but I think he feels the same way. It makes you yearn for the good old-fashioned criticism of interpretation of a film on the part of a philosopher now, 30 years after l'ondata strutturalistica, il significante della decostruzione. This is like a serious, beautiful interpretation of L'Eclisse di Antonioni, and it's beautiful that he actually is the professor interpreting it, and then the students respond and add to it. It's a fantastic piece. I will give it to my students immediately because that's the way I think good interpretation should be. Then we have an essay by Massimo Cacciari, History and Destiny. I do have some problems with Cacciari's way of dealing with the question of destiny. It seems to me that although I would never say that in his presence, but when he speaks of destining, Geschichte, it sounds a little bit, it comes from his reading of Nietzsche and Heidegger, and there's some echoes to some of the work of Attimo, of limiti, of descending. But that's something that I can only pick up slowly in a paper that I will publish. I would not say here, but certainly. The one that I like is Massimo Donat. Massimo Donat, the original Betrayal, Nihilism, and the Nullification of the Negative, deals with the 3 great interpreters of Parmenides and Plato in Italy, that is Severino and Cacciari, but also Heidegger. Basically, he upholds what I believe has been a thesis of my own work, that in the West we're all children of Platonism to some degree, and even though he goes back through Severino to demonstrate that Plato tried to commit parricide, as he calls vis-a-vis Parmenides, he does not succeed, because being is, and it cannot not be, is a kind of statement that does not admit of a negation. And all we have done in the West is try to invent ways of negating that, so we have an excuse for justifying an opposition. And both Severino and Donat seem to hold that that is at the root of our drive and the whole concept of techne, of oltrepassamento, of doing something. So it's a kind of a perverse kind of paradigm in which we get in. We're always trying to sort of outdo ourselves and reprove ourselves. Rocco Ronchi, I do not remember Philosophy in Oblivion. It's a beautiful piece on memory and the paradox of when you cannot remember something and you say it's on the tip of my tongue, you don't remember the specific thing that you want to remember, but the fact that you can say that means that there is what the Heideggerians would call a force structure already in your mind, which means you know that you don't know, but you actually do know, although you cannot remember. So it's a very sophisticated play, and I hope maybe you want to say something more about that, because I would have to reread it again. Severino, Techniques, Nihilism and Truth. Severino is one who should be translated and commented. Is a little bit difficult, but basically Il Destino dell'Occidente is dominated by the idea of techne. I remember reading a book of his when I was in Milan on Gli Abitatori del Tempo, which I found interesting, Abitatori anziché abitanti. Destino della Necessità, right? This is the work. The thing about that I appreciate about Severino, at least 20 years ago, was that he had entered into a great battle, both with the theologians, Christianity, as well as with the Marxists. So he was always kind of like, he found his own philosophy. But what he said about the Christianity was that in a way, Christianity was a way of getting away easy, talking about the archaeos, Vitiello was saying, if you do go back to an idea of an archaeo, of a primum mobile, of a God, somehow a lot of other things become easier, but Severino doesn't believe that. Being has always existed. How long ago is always? Always. L'essere c'è, punto. E non può non esserci. So it's a difficult thinker in that sense. Carlo Sini, beyond language, I will let Alessandro speak about Sini since he studied with him. His idea of language as limit is probably some of that must have filtered in your book on Leopardi. Indirectly, not directly. Yeah, because you work with that idea of saying what cannot be said, or if you say it, you sort of lose the distance. So there's something about it. And I have to say there's a couple of American continental philosophers who are working on this idea of limit and how different it is from the concept of boundary. Whereas the boundary or the confino, it's something concrete, but you look, and it implies an inside and an outside, whereas I think, if I understand correctly, Sini is working with the idea of language as limit without an internal limit, without an inside or an outside. So it's not something that you can project on Cartesian coordinates. And then there's one thing about Agamben and Perniola. Like Alessandro, I am still wondering why Agamben is so popular, but I like the early Agamben of the 70s and the 80s. I just don't understand, but maybe I haven't read them carefully over the last 10, 15 years, if they're almost accurate. But I do remember Infanzia Storia as being a really important book. In fact, I used one of his quotes in an essay of mine from an early essay that appeared in Out, where there was a revelation, and I actually, I'll come to it, but it has to do with the fact that what makes the human being human as opposed to, let's say, an animal, which is lately has been talking about in the bioethics thing, is that Homo sapiens, translating something from Wittgenstein at that time, is Homo sapiens loque, l'uomo che sa di parlare, is what brings us into contact with the Logos. And that was some really, at that time I thought it was a big revelation for me, but I think in the last 15, 20 years he has moved elsewhere. Roberta di Monticelli, What is Choice, ties in with some other essays. I don't want to take too much time. Do we have free will? Do we have choice? I am really concerned about that because at least in this country, a lot of this discussion has been appropriated by neurobiology and behaviorists from MIT. There was a book that just came out by someone called Sam Harris about free will. Is free will possible? No, it's not possible because now with MRIs and all special kinds of technology, they can demonstrate that before I'd say, I want to lift my hand, 300 milliseconds before there's a connection in a part of my brain, which means the connection has already happened, so I'm not deciding anything. What's missing, I think, in contemporary philosophy of science is the philosophy part. I mean, I think it's all like technology, and it's all what you can demonstrate and you can measure. So I read both the Monticelli and another piece on that you have in here on choice and determination. The good parts that are really new, like rule in the sense that were not being talked about in the 90s when everybody was still in the throes of the decline of Marxism and structuralism and Pensiero debole and Nietzsche and so on and so forth, is the unpolitical. And I've read your translation of Cacciari. I know Cacciari's Crisis. I still am trying to come to grips with what the unpolitical is because it doesn't seem to imply any opposition. It's not a category of opposition like political, non-political, but if it's something that implies the political in a non-categorical, non-confrontational, non-oppositional way, I can deal with that. But living in the polis a certain amount of either intentionality or response to someone else is implicit, is implied, is necessary, and I don't know how he actually works that out. However, the Esposito's passage from the unpolitical to biopolitics, Esposito, I'm just discovering him myself, works through the genealogy through Foucault. The biopolitics is a new topic, and for those of you who are younger and need a topic for the thesis, I think it's a big issue because it implies the whole thing that there's not just man in an anthropological sense that commands and controls nature and society, but we all sort of partner in all of this together. So it goes with environmentalism, and it goes with a connection between culture and nature. And in that regard, the last part of the ontology, among the writers that I appreciate a lot, is our common friend Lollini, who has this beautiful paper on Vico. He's been a scholar of Vico since I know him. And although we know that Vico believed that man can only know what he himself makes, that we can only know in social institutions, but we can never really know nature in a Cartesian kind of mechanistic way. But he does recover out of Vico a connection and a symbiosis sort of thing. That's not the poor word, but with nature. That is, culture and nature do go together, and that goes to the origin of our own civilization. And in a way, it sort of corrects, he sort of distanced himself from both Said and Auerbach, and I found that very interesting. By the way, Alessandro makes a nice observation in the introduction, which is a cultural thing about the profession of being an Italian intellectual as opposed to an American intellectual. In this country, I was educated, I went to Italy and I picked up both sides of how people talk about these things. In this country, when you go to a philosophical round table or in criticism, it's very normal to say, but Professor so-and-so does not understand that, or he is wrong, the real position is this. And it's accepted in American academia to politely say, well, I totally disagree, I don't think you're on the right track. But in the Italian tradition, there's all these kind of circuitous ways in which Italian syntax through, going back to the Middle Ages and the Baroque allows us to do, where you actually say the opposite, and you actually can destroy somebody, but he doesn't even know, because you can actually say such a subtle way, veramente, that nuance there, that translation there, that note there, and you go around, and at the end you actually totally contradict somebody, but there's this kind of graceful way of doing it, and that's one of the cultural differences you bring out. You can tell I could talk about this book for another hour, but maybe I'll come back in some responses later. And I want to give some time to my friend and teacher, Paolo Valesio.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'll walk over there because I can't read and like the president, we couldn't chew gum and walk at the same time. I can't remove the papers and I don't mean to be pompous, but good evening, thank you for being here. The beginning would be not simply an act of duty, but really meant as a agreement with what Peter has been saying about the importance of this special issue of a journal, because this in fact looks like a book, it is like a book, but it is the special issue of the journal Annali Italianistica. Now, special issue means technically an issue dedicated to a single subject, but I think the special issue is really special, thanks to Alessandro Carrera, and it's an epoch-making issue, not the least element of which is Carrera's great job of editing. Carrera explains, footnotes, annotates that the average Italian philosopher presupposes the knowledge of Greek and Latin, 2 or 3 years of philosophy, some German, some French, and it presupposes it, it just doesn't explain. And Carrera patiently annotates and gives some hint at what is going on, and I think it is a great job. It is, on the other hand, with an anthology, rather, it would be equally tiresome and useless to criticize an anthology for its absences, and even worse, of course, to criticize it for its presences, especially if I I'm the one there in the weakest part of the view, as Peter pointed out, but anyway, I am there. I think it's much more useful to think of possible future integrations going on with the work of Carrera. To me, the most needed integration, and this is itself a phenomenon that would deserve an essay, is the theologians. It has become fashionable in philosophy today to drop the word theology. It's a theological problem, theologians say. Now, theologians are rarely heard, and here theologians are totally absent. It would be nice to hear from them, especially when we think of bioethics and so forth. So I think a future task would be that of having a real theologian really write a piece, because I assure you that there are a lot of theological books around written by theologians. And it is a bit worrisome to notice that philosophers, otherwise extremely careful, as Peter pointed out, in their distinctions, heap together theologians, historians of religion, philosophers of religion, priests, nuns, and so forth and so on. The church is mentioned in a very vague way. So we really, I think, one missing, and this is not a criticism of Alessandro. Alessandro, in fact, the ideal situated to edit a special issue of theology. In general, I will not try to comment any single essay specifically, but just some fragments, some slivers of reflections that I will move back and forth on, and I quote rarely. But one question that, in a sense, emerges also from the very interesting interviews we saw, is the question of this question: are we out of the general atmosphere of Marxism, orphanhood, or orphanism? I don't know. We speak in the wake of the death, as you know, at 95, of the great Marxist historian, Eric J. Hobsbawm, died a few days ago. Are we out of there, or are we still contending with this orphanhood? I'll get back to this in a second. Translation. I mentioned my admiration for the job that Alessandro does, and for the heroic effort of the translators to translate Italian philosophers. I have a question. Again, there are 2 or 3 questions I'm just throwing to Carrera, Peter, and others. There is a technical problem of translation, of course. It is very difficult to translate Italian essays. There is a philosophical problem of translation that I think Gentile described much more lucidly than Benjamin, if I may say, in the 20s. So I'm not rehearsing that. But what I am observing, in a more anecdotal sense perhaps, and it was brought to me almost dramatically in the interviews, we are, and I will use a notion, perhaps a heavy one, but I would like to try it, of neo-colonial. The situation in which we are right now acting is slightly neo-colonial. In a French gathering, none of us would even think of speaking English, and everybody would pretend to understand French. When Peter, Alessandro, and I speak English, well, I suppose we are acceptable enough, but I mean, there is a betrayal going on, and there is a deep deformation of our thought. We heard these philosophers. We heard the natural. I especially enjoyed Vattimo. I was reminded of Vattimo in New York. Vattimo is an interesting talker. I like to hear him talk. And it's useful to have silent subtitles, yes. But the fact that Peter and I and Alessandro are speaking English, it is slightly worrisome to me. I will go on speaking English, and I'm not criticizing the English of my colleagues. I'm saying there is a subtle betrayal going there that deforms our thought. It is important, of course, the title of Carrera's essay it's consideration of the present and the future of critical theory. And it is important, of course, to look back at what it was. In one of the essays, I think by Rubini, is a very good essay of the history of the tradition of thinkers from Croce, Gentile, Paris, Paci, and so forth and so on. But and so I think an historical awareness, even anecdotal, like Paci's lesson and so forth, is important. But what then would be the future of critical theory? Well, to put it briefly, I think it would be a situation in which both the adjective and the substantive would be transcended or sublated, if we prefer, or done away with. Alessandro appropriately noticed that critical theory is a category that in Italian is not normally used. But the question goes beyond the translation, felicity, or anything like this. Both words to me are, again, I use the word words. Theory is a rigid intellectual category. It's a category that too easily overlaps with ideology. The preferred trick, of course, of critical theorists is to call ideology the theory of the adversaries. The enemy has an ideology, I have a theory. That hasn't fully worked to me, but anyway, there is something like cage-like. The term critic, of course, we are critical of ourselves and others, but critic is a polemic term, a term which evokes the old discourse of demystification, deconstruction, dissacrazione, and so forth. The rhetoric of criticism was plausible when the idea was that the critical critic, the hypercritic critic, had a general idea or utopia in mind, or something better than the situation he criticized. That, of course, was basically the Marxist utopia. When this disappeared from the horizon, I'm afraid that what is left, if we insist too much on critical theory, is an atmosphere of ressentiment. I actually use Nietzsche's word. The school of suspicion that was, in my youth, was considered the great master. It's the one who were suspicious of things, Freud, Weber, and so forth. Well, the school of suspicion today maybe looks like what the old but still interesting critic of Yale would call the school of resentment. And I don't think that's what we should be, where we should be today. What then would I substitute to critical theory? Well, I'm nostalgic for a kind of questioning but compassionate thought. And I use the word compassionate because it seems to me it accommodates, maybe in a rhetorical sense, but the Buddhist idea, the Islamic idea, and the Judeo-Christian caritas. And I think that would be useful to keep in mind. Apropos of the orphanhood of Marxism, there are essays here who rehearse all the vicarious, the substitutions of this great orphan, which I take seriously. My tone is not ironic when I speak of the orphan. Environmental causes, feminism, disability studies, and so forth and so on. And these are, of course, the persistent rhetoric of the other. The other. We have to identify with the other, including the verb othering. We have to do some othering here. Well, I agree with this. I respect this idea. We cannot, of course, ignore the other. But I wonder, even leaving aside the strong version, that to be still is very plausible, that we can't really relate to the other if we do not have in mind the radically other, the valde aliud part of my Latin, okay? Even if we do not subscribe to this strong theory, I would like to hear a warmer language here. I hear an intellectualistic and rather arid defense of othering, and I'm not so fully convinced. I already spoke about ethics, bioethics, I already spoke about translation. Two last points, and they are critical, but I won't mention the author. I don't want to make it too personal, they are not here anyway. But to mention some preoccupation. In general, the tone of the essays is refined and respectful, and dialogic as befits an issue on critical theory. I learned enormously from all of them. There were two passages that worried me, that seemed to be an exception to that tone, and well, first of all, let me mention a passage which was not an exception to that tone, which was a very interesting point, but which that was due to Cacciari. Cacciari had the courage, I think alone in the whole journal issue, to mention the name, I'm trying to find this passage, to mention a name of a philosopher that is coyly, demurely evoked if tall. It seems to me that this philosopher, which pervades the whole panorama of our existential, whatever we mean by the existentialist, has the position today that Sade used to have in the 19th century. In the 19th century, Sade was alluded to coyly, but not really quoted, until Barthes came around. Cacciari had the courage to vote him, and he says, "The form of the epoch nourishes itself from the life of the individual." He's talking about History and Destiny, as Peter reminded us, page 62. "The form of the epoch nourishes itself from the life of the individual. It does not save it as such at all. This is the reason for the Kierkegaardian out between historical consciousness and faith," which is fine. It is a bit opaque to get at, and never in the whole essay it's made clear that the out of Kierkegaard between historical consciousness and faith is the idea that destiny is basically the destiny of salvation. That, I think, would contribute to situate the discussion, whether or not one agrees with it, but I'm very happy that in his very, that Cacciari has the courage to engage or to quote at least Kierkegaard. Now, to the passages, two passages are in some sort related. You maybe can see where my preoccupation go. I will quote these two passages to show work that we have to do, not to enter into a polemic, but I hope you can see where I am going. One of these philosophers, really, in my humble opinion, should know better, at a certain point quotes, does not quote, refers contemptuously to some thinkers, to some kind of thinkers, and he refers to what he calls the, he speaks about language, and he speaks a little bit ironically of those people who are fully satisfied with the dissatisfaction of expression. Among them, we find a long line of spiritualists, irrationalists, theoretical mystics. Practical mystics wisely keep quiet and apply themselves fruitfully to the worthy exercises, and those who have an obsession for the supernatural. I find it a bit dismissing, I find it a bit condescending, and I don't think this is a useful way to go. Another problem that we may have in a very good essay about the passage from Gentile to Parison, and I know that Peter is particularly interested about Parison, is the nervousness. This is an American scholar. The persisting nervousness, I think it was mentioned by Vattimo, but Vattimo mentioned it almost jokingly, and as you know, saying as young men were worried about that, but, and this is about Gentile. The otherwise diligent expression and description of Gentile's thought is animated by a great nervousness to explain that, yes, Gentile is good, Gentile is important, but Gentile was a fascist, so we should be careful. It seems to me we might relax maybe about that, and at a certain point, I read the following phrase. It quotes from Gentile, and we know that Gentile can be quite dizzying sometimes, and I think that Teoria dello Spirito come out pure, the great masterpiece of 20th century philosophy, but that's will be discussed, especially by Peter, I suppose. But at a certain point he says, well, we have here a fascistic implosion of difference into identity. Let's stop a minute here. Suppose I say, I'm reading Gramsci, they say, well, okay, he's speaking of la dittatura del proletariato. Okay, we have a communistic implosion into identity. I will be laughed out of the class. I will consider it slightly demented, frankly. So I am worried, and I return to this point. I finished my remarks at this point. I hope to hear more from Peter and from Alessandro. We have to be aware, I think, we all of us, Italian scholars or Italianists, of the difference, the different climate, the different way in which we, whether or not we speak English, by the way, we may speak Italian, the different way in which we are encouraged to talk about Italian culture here. Sometimes this is enlightening and important. Sometimes I think this evokes a bit a spirit of post-colonial or neo-colonial condescension. I find the way in which we are obliged almost to declare that we are not fascists when we read Gentile, I find it a bit post-colonial. I find it a bit worrisome. I find it a bit deforming of the way in which we might read the text of the Italian tradition. Because this, of course, is not a preoccupation that Italian scholars have, unless one is scientifically studying the relationship between the philosopher and the regime and so forth and so on. So, the great importance of this issue, and I, by the way, share Peter's appreciation for Massimo Donar's piece, for Severino's piece, which I think Severino is a secular mystic, I call it. But anyway, my way of expressing the admiration for this issue, I hope I'm not misunderstood here, at most I can be accused of perversity, my way of underscoring the importance of this issue is to underscore all the open challenges that it evokes, both subjectively, in Alessandro's careful choice, and objectively, in the fact that we are talking about Italian philosophers and translating them, Italian philosophers and thinkers, in what we are encouraged to call critical theory, and that's already a skewed view, and to reflect together on how much more skewed views we have that perhaps we can slightly adjust. Thank you.
I will use this one, okay. Before I say anything else, I want to say that I have some volumes here that I can give to you if you're interested after our speech, but also that I made a careful choice about the cover of this book. These are two works of a very important artist, Franca Gitti, very well known here at the University, the New York University, because she was here many times and she was a very good friend of many of us. And I really wanted to have not just something of her, but something of Italian contemporary art, which is something that we overlook, but Italian contemporary art is not, not to be overlooked. There are interesting things happening, and I really thought that those images were in a way representative of something that we are striving to do, that is to get past this post-colonial or neo-colonial attitude that we may have in perfectly good faith, and I feel guilty about that. I feel guilty because when I started working on this book and during the whole process of editing this book, which took almost 3 years because of the amount of material that I received, I had to find a translator, to find the budget, the money to pay them, and then some of the articles have gone through 4 revisions. And maybe they were translated by native speakers who are with Harvard PhDs and people who have knowledge of academic language. but nonetheless, translating Italian philosophy into English is something that will make you despair, because the complexity of Italian culture, not because we are dealing with 15 Martin Heidegger here, and this is not the point. The point is that even a graduate student in Italy speaks like Martin Heidegger. and that's because there is such a long tradition of philosophical speech, philosophical thought, philosophical rhetoric, and a shared common knowledge of phrases, quotes, references that go back 3,000 years, possibly. And of course they take it for granted because it's a fishbowl after all, so everybody knows each other, so they know what they're talking about. They don't have to explain too much. You read the book of Cacciari, he never explains what he's saying, because he jumps to conclusion from page 1. And you are supposed to have read all the books that he has read, and you are supposed to know all the languages that he knows. And he's not the only one. I mean, even a philosopher such as Severino, who is comparatively easier to read, it's not easier at all. Because then just the surface may sound easier to understand, but in the end it's not. And this is a problem that, yes, we may complain that when we try to translate this stuff into another language, we may fall into a neo-colonial mode because we sort of apologize for our complexity. But on the other, or our obscurity or abstruseness, if you want. On the other hand, I am firmly convinced that today, if you either write in English or translate a piece of national culture into English, you have to think that your book may travel to Indonesia or Mongolia, and they have to be able to understand something. Not just here in New York, where it can be comparatively easy. But far, far away from it. I know that Italian philosophy has been translated in Japanese, in other languages as well. So if we want to really be players in the global culture, well, some adjustment will have to be done. And not necessarily for the better. I mean, not necessarily that this adjustment will bring necessarily, a better conclusion, a better style, or a better minds, better philosophers. We may scale it a little back. I really tried not to lose any complexity of in the articles that I've included in this journal, and that is why all the articles went through 3 or 4 revisions. For example, let's take an example, Massimo Donà, because it's a very intricate piece. First it was translated by a native speaker, and then it went for the first revision to someone who has a PhD in classical studies in Harvard and knows Italian, Latin, Greek very well. And then it went through my 3rd revision, and then the 4th revision with the editor at the Annali Italianistica office. After the 4th revision, it was a 5th revision on my part and the adding of notes. So just on that article, I chronicled the time that I spent only on one article after all the 4 revisions, and I spent 45 hours just for that article. So you see, I mean, is there something wrong with that? Or are we missing something? Do we need to change our course, or is it okay like it is? I mean, we could also be extremely proud of ourselves and say, okay, if we really want to understand us, go through the same kind of training that people in Italy went through, and so I'll see you in 5 years, and maybe you can get something. I'm not trying to solve this problem here and now. I just want to be candid about it, because I have no solution, and I don't think there is a solution. There are authors who are more difficult, authors who are less difficult, and when you see, the translations that appear now in English quite frequently, you can see that. You see that there are authors that are more successful, and sometimes the authors that are more successful are authors that already speak a language that is in part translatable. On the other hand, there is not so much a neo-colonial thing, but certainly a gap that we have to overcome. We had this problem in the past more than it is now. But I remember an episode, for example, and I think Peter remembers it too because he was there. It was many years ago. I came to the United States in 1987, and I found out, to my surprise, that some contemporary Italian philosophers were not unknown in the United States, and at the time there was a lot of talk about Matthias weak thought, although the book came out just now.
Valesio was published in the Graduate Faculty Philosophy Journal in 1984. So
yes.
For whoever cared to find out, it was available.
Yes. And I remember when the first time that I gave a paper at an Italianist conference, a paper on Italian philosophy, and in fact it was on Sini and Vattimo, something that I'm happy that I wrote back then. I would rather forget it right now. But I happened to mention that a certain passage in Carlo Sini, in which he, drawing from Heraclit, makes a distinction between public and private language, and he says that in private language we do not say the same things that we say in public language, and in fact they are two different languages. They have different rules, if private language has any discernible rule at all, so that when we deal, for example, and he made the point, made a pun, in fact, that in Italian when you say linguaggio privato, it means it's a private language, but at the same time it's deprived. Privato is also deprived language. And of course it is deprived of its public function. So it's not deprived because it's weaker or less important. It's deprived of the most common understood public function. And after I finished my talk, my paper, there was a scholar in the audience who was not American, by the way, and not even Italian, who rather resentfully asked me, and just because in Italian private means deprived, now does that mean that every time that I use the word private, do I have to remember that it means deprived? And so I said, well, we in all field of continental philosophy and literary theory and critical studies have put up for so many years with difference and difference, with verfremdung and entfernung, with, whatever, verfremdung or entwertung, Verbindung, and so on and so forth. So why not to allow some wordplay in Italian too? Are we so inferior, or is it Italian language is so unsophisticated that it cannot allow for any wordplay, or are we just second-class citizens? So the scholar I'm talking about apologized to me later on in private. So I don't know if there is a solution to that. I think it's a matter. It's more than anything else. It's a matter of cultural capital. What kind of cultural capital, cultural weight you can put on the table. How much do you matter? That's the point. If you matter a lot, they will take you seriously. If your country matters a lot, if your institutions matter a lot, if the scholars are translated and become best-selling authors, yes, that matters a lot. If that doesn't happen, you don't matter a lot. It's a question of market, unfortunately. It's a question of market. So it's not that a book like this or any other book like this will solve the problem. We just have to think beyond that. You want to say something?
Yeah, I understand what is. I just want. My point was not that we are so learned in Italian that people have to be learned. No, it was the opposite. What I was revealed in looking at the short documentary was how much more natural and colloquial the word of philosophy is. When Vattimo evokes this Perugia landscape, when Sini speaks of his lesson in Milan, they make their thoughts more available. In other words, when we speak, quando noi parliamo nella nostra lingua materna, anche le più difficili frasi hanno un'aria di famiglia, hanno un'aria colloquialmente comprensibile, per cui anche i concetti più complicati almeno abbiamo un'illusione di capirli. E questo è quello che perdiamo quando passiamo noi italiani all'inglese, e sempre questo l'inglese all'italiano. Cioè it was a plea for simplicity, the great simplicity that I hear when somebody speaks the language. Look at the mouth of the people, as Martin Luther used to say. Look at the mouth. I was looking at the mouth of the philosophers, and I missed it.
Oh yes, that's right. You know, I think I was just I was making an appendix to what I called in my introduction the sales speech.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And after that, you know, we can move on to other theoretical dimensions, because after all they are more important. I don't want to rob time from Peter, so I just want to say a couple of things about some specific points raised by Peter and Paolo here about theology. In fact, Bruno Forte was on my list. I wanted to contact him together with other people who are not included in this volume. I only realized that it took a second volume or a budget that I did not have. You know, so I sent the first salvo of emails to several people, and thinking that only few of them I would have answered, but in fact almost all of them answered, almost immediately. So I already had a lot of material, and so I could not send the second salvo of emails because my budget was already strained. And so that's the reason why, for example, you don't have an essay by Mattimo or Agamben or Bruno Forte or Piero Coda, for example, and so scholars in that other direction that in fact I would have liked to include. It would take a second volume, but I don't think I will live long enough to do it, not now at least. Another point that is quite important is well, two at least. One is about the difficulty that I fully realize of grasping the concept of the unpolitical in Cacciari, although Cacciari's essay here in the book does not really address that issue, only peripherally. But I just would like to say that maybe one way to understand what it means when it speaks of the unpolitical is precisely to go back to the difference between boundary and limit. The unpolitical, the way he intends it, as far as I've understood, is not the boundary of politics, but the limit of politics, the internal limits. And it's the impossible of politics. It's what politics in itself and maybe also for itself will never able to do. And what is this? Well, I think it goes back to the issue of representation or symbolization, we may say. The idea of representation is extremely important in Cacciari's political philosophy. He uses that word. We may be more familiar with the word symbolization. However, Alain Badiou speaks of representation at the same time, so I think we can use that word. The real issue here is what is the political movement, the political force, the political entity, the political strategy that can or cannot be represented, find a representation, you know, or find a symbolization. That's a major issue. So when you have some political flow, so to speak, that finds a political outcome, an outlet, in the end it can be represented, it becomes a political force, then that's the moment when political philosophy stops. So that's the problem of political philosophy. When real politics begins, the political philosophy stops. So you may ask, what's the purpose of political philosophy at this point? Because it looks like sports writing. Sports writing begins after the game, and political philosophy begins before the game. But when the game actually starts, the political philosopher is silent, because now what he's speaking about has found a representation that is beyond the boundaries or the limits of what he can talk about. It will go its own way, whatever way it is. It's a problem also addressed by Alain Badiou in his book Metapolitics of 1999. Badiou is much more radical than Cacciari. In fact, he thinks that real political events do not have any representation, and they must be kept that way. You know, who knows whether I mean, the French Revolution was not representable, was not symbolizable until it became a government, until it became the Directory or Napoleon or whatever, but then it was a different thing. So we are left with this metaphysical entity in the view of the unrepresentable political event, which may go in whatever direction. However, this is a marginal point to note that I wanted to make, but on something else here, that is the very name critical theory, that I have used. Of course, I've used it, it's part of the sales pitch. I didn't want to call the book Italian philosophy because not all the articles included are strictly about philosophy, continental or whatever. And so there's a lot of articles that deal with art. They quote philosophers, they are into the philosophical matter, but not 100%. And I wanted to point out that Paolo Valesio's article, I think it was very important to include it. It is not a philosophical article, but it was trying to find, this is what I thought, a theory of literature in literature itself, and not outside of literature, and that is what interested me, the literature of theory in literature. Because this is what philosophy does. In philosophy it's impossible to distinguish between the text and the critic. Every new text is a critic of a previous philosopher, and at the same time is a new text. So if that is possible in literature, and I think that Paolo Valesio's article did that very brilliantly, I wouldn't call it philosophy, but I would like to include it in my collection, definitely. But the second thing is this. I was perfectly aware of the fact that by calling this book Italian critical theory, I was operating a reductionism, sort of reductionism. Because one thing that I'm fairly convinced of, and I'm not the only one, of course, is that philosophy cannot be reduced to cultural criticism. Philosophy is an engagement with truth. Sorry for being Platonist, but it is an engagement with truth. Even if you don't believe in truth, that doesn't matter. You are still engaged with truth. You are engaged with the impossibility of truth, or with the possibility. If you are a Platonist, you believe that sooner or later you will get it. If you are a non-Platonist, you will discuss with Plato, trying to explain to him that it will not be possible to achieve truth. But you are in the same field. So what is it that is outside the field of the engagement with truth? Pure sophistry. Pure sophistry. Sophistry is, the sophist is the intellectual who is intelligent, fine, refined, has a good rhetoric, beautiful way of expressing himself, can become a famous journalist, can become a pundit on TV. He will never be engaged with truth. He will be engaged with, I called in the introduction, with the new revisionism of Nietzsche. When Nietzsche said there are no facts, there are only interpretations, he was referring polemically to the contemporary positivists. Well, today the sophist truth is there are no facts, there's only spin. So if you are in the world of spin, that's perfectly fine. You can make a lot of money too, but that's not philosophy, I'm sorry. So if you reduce philosophy from what it is, its main field, to mere cultural criticism, you reduce philosophy to sophistry. That is.
Well, I have a couple of comments. First, I want to say a few more good things about the work, and then, just disagree with you, politely disagree with you on a few things. Okay, 2 minutes. One point about this book, that's really crucial that I did not get a chance to speak about before, in which I entreat everyone to look into, is something which is relatively new on the Italian panorama, which is geophilosophy, or under which you can put Mediterranean studies. This is something that comes out from the 90s. It's the good part of post-colonial criticism, if we wish. And marginally or tangentially, it touches upon a question you raised that I mentioned at the beginning, but which we just didn't talk about, although it's implicit in your, Paolo, in your discussion about translation and speaking a different language, on the one hand, and your experience with Gentile and so on the other. That is, what is a national literature? Did it ever exist? I must say, by the way, that Paolo Valesio said this about 30 years ago. He said, when is it like the Gentile is that far behind us that we can finally read him again? I think it was like in 1985, or you must have said that, because that was already 40 years after the war. Because, you know, just like we write Ezra Pound, how long do we have to wait to denazify Ezra Pound, you know, or defascistize the Ezra Pound? I remember you used that expression about Celine as well. So that's an open question. I don't know if we have time for anyone to intervene on that, and I would like to maybe hear what Raymond has to say, if there's such a thing as a national literature. But the thing about the Mediterranean that's good, the geophilosophy, is that it shifts the emphasis from the word national to the word, my way of looking at region. And that's in the program that we're trying to establish at Stony Brook. Instead of calling it European languages, literatures, and cultures, I insisted that we call it, instead of a European language, national literature. We have five languages, 5 literatures. So in order not to say Italian within European, or French within European, or Russian within European, I said regional languages and literatures under the umbrella of European, and so that we can also include Mediterranean studies. Now, geophilosophy, again, I have some problems with the way Cacciari handled it, but be that as it may, I strongly suggest you read Norman Bouchard's summary, which focuses on Franco Cassano, Pensiero Meridiano. Oddly enough, she doesn't mention Armando Agnisci, but that could be her choice. I think, in a way, he's one of the few post-colonial critics in Italy. As far as your last point, well, I wanted to actually go back to something that Paolo said before, but I think that we maybe want some space for the audience. The thing about spin, the thing about the truth, the thing about this, the Platonism and this and that, it's all fine, except that I don't think that the opposite of that is sophistry, because as you will see now that my book is coming out, if properly interpreted, I think the sophists actually understood something about the way language works, which finally takes us from this kind of obsession between Parmenides and Plato and all the way down to Severino, because it made me spin what we're seeing. And if you follow the presidential debates, you know that right now, and I see that in my book on the postmodern, which you so gently and gentlemen reviewed, if we don't have the truth anymore, we only have, as Baudrillard used to say, simulacra. If we cannot touch, even dream of touching any kind of transcendental truth, the fact of the matter is that historical humans live the life of the effects of these, let's say, institutionalized lies, as some of the people in speak also. And if that's what we have, then that's what we have to analyze and work with. So therefore, instead of looking at searching for the truth, I would like to search for the communication at that particular point in time, even fully aware that somebody is lying, but somebody lying from the Oval Office and somebody lying in my classroom, all of a sudden I have to say there's a big difference over here. One has an impact. One affects millions of lives, one impacts on 15. So I want to bring the thing about, move away from ontology to the ontic, to the more materialism. You actually indirectly, from spiritualism to materialism, I think indirectly also believe in that there is a kind of like a humilitas, a down-to-earthness that we need to also keep in mind as we go in our interpersonal social relationships. The thing of the search for the absolute truth, whether it's an arche or a grund, or whether it's that of Christianity or that of Buddhism, to me has always resulted in a kind of looking at the social world from the top down. And I think instead, the world of the sophist is the world of actual interaction, teaching for the moment, for the occasion, because that's what counts, that moment. But I'm sorry, I'll stop right here, and I would love to leave some time for somebody in the audience, unless of course you want to respond, but you know, I could go on. But
I was speaking of an engagement with the truth, or not that you already think that you can reach it, but so you can engage it in many ways, even don't believe in it, but you want to engage it.
Well, okay.
You know, that, but I will stop here.
The versions of the truth. Le versioni della verità.
Anything, any question?
No questions?
Any question?
It is late.
Well, we have 5
Anyway,
minutes.
We can go there. Oh, so you can go there, it's better, go there.
Italian philosophy is a philosophy of impure reason. Yes. Best results in Italian philosophy are aesthetics, philosophy of history, political philosophy, rhetoric, meaning that we don't have anymore the possibility to think more geometrical. There was a break in Italian history, the Renaissance. We don't have the same tradition like English-speaking people or Spanish too. That is the continuity with Scholastic. And Scholastic had the possibility to have a logical thinking, to be shorter in sentences, which are long and difficult. But anyway, Italian philosophy is very complex, and we have a kind of civil philosophy. We don't have, let's say, a negative position against science. We had Galileo, we had Marconi, and so on. But we didn't have until the beginning of 20th century philosophy of science. This is particularly interesting. And second point, we in the philosophical landscape in Italy, we see now the decline of postmodernism, of hermeneutics, and the return of the so-called new realism. That is, we have a philosophical opposition between Vattimo and Ferraris. This is chronicle. But what is important is speaking of sophistically and truth, that and speaking of theologians, that the debate on relativism that the former Pope John Paul II, when he spoke of veritas splendor, that is that truth is splendid, but he meant Christian truth. And so relativism against truth became a false fight, because I agree with Alessandro, philosophers need truth, but also when Peter spoke of the sophists, apropos language, for sophists are also interesting. And when we thought that Plato in Gorgias, for example, showed Socrates speaking with Callicles, sometimes Callicles is right and Socrates is wrong. But this doesn't mean that the truth is not important. I remember speaking with Italian scholars what Dante said in the fourth book of Paradise, that everyone is seeking truth like a beast is seeking its den. So, I want to quote it in Italian, but it's too late. Muoversi in esso come fera in lustra, tosto che giunta là e giunta nel polla, sino ogni disio sarebbe frusta. Meaning that if truth doesn't exist, our life doesn't have any meaning.
Thank you. Ci sono altre domande? There are other questions? No? Okay. Thank you everybody for being here. Alessandro Carrera, Paolo Valesio, and Peter Carravetta. Thank you, Professor Remo Godet, for being with us this evening for this brilliant closing speech he has given. Thank you, Gabrielle, for having presented Professor Alessandro Carrera. I think that this evening has been an important turning page. This is my impression. Thank you.